genius designer, director, even actor, and certainly illustrator, British, the son of Ellen Terry, the cousin of John Gielgud, and I had gotten a bourse, that is to say a grant, offered me by the Beaux-Arts, the French government, to go be his assistant and help him organize his materials in his very old age. He was brilliant, irascible man, and it couldn't have been a more wonderful offer. I then decided to come back to this country over the summer to see my family, which I hadn't seen in 2 or 2.5 years. And I never went back to pick up that particular opportunity, that job. And one of the reasons I mention it is there's a pattern, looking back now at almost 93, that emerged in my life and career, is that very frequently when I had to make a choice between my career and somehow some aspect of my family, I would choose my family rather than very interesting opportunities in my career. And I mentioned that just in passing. Not that I was a very good family member, nor a very good parent, or certainly not a very great husband to Rochelle for 47 years of marriage, etc. But that was the pattern that I left what was certainly one of my favorite and best jobs at Penn State, at a head of a program that I fashioned that was very good and that won all kinds of awards. And I left for several family reasons to go to Boston, to BU, to certainly one of the unhappiest 3 years I've ever had working. So that there was a pattern that has emerged several times in my life in which, for one reason or another, when I have had interesting jobs or opportunities in the face of the family that I felt I was not fully contributing to, I made decisions to give up a job that I might have liked or did like or that sort of thing. And eventually I would come back to New York, where Rochelle was certainly happiest. And so, when I came back to New York, I've been over some of that material, and one of the things I did, of course, was I joined the Living Theater with Julian Beck and Judith Molina, and for a couple of years, the three of us ran that together. And I directed and acted, and Julian designed. He could be very brilliant. He was actually a very good abstract painter. And he acted, and Judith, of course, acted. And this was before Judith had her nose bobbed, and which I always felt was a great mistake. At any rate, after 2 years, it was clear that we were moving in different directions for any number of reasons. artistic, personal, and the ground was not very good. So, by mutual consent, I left the Living Theatre. It had something to do with the fact that we were in politically different camps, and also aesthetically, I was finally not interested in what emerged as their form of revolutionary, as it were, theater. You know, dance naked in front of the audience, invite them to get undressed and get involved too. I wasn't going in that direction, and they were, and that was fine. And then, at that point, I had, I think I've said this before, become an assistant to Sanford Meisner at the great acting school. And this was important because I was learning something about acting that I really didn't know, and certainly didn't know in any organized way. That most of my background had been in rather classical British type of understanding of what acting was, which was largely poetic declamation. And whereas with Sandy, I was getting that whole tradition from Stanislavski and the group theater, Stella Adler and Sandy, and the background in Yiddish theater, which led to the group theater in some ways, and in which, just incidentally, for a brief moment when I was in my late high school years, I did walk-ons in a little bit of Maurice Schwartz productions at the Yiddish Art Theater. Nothing. I wouldn't have been mentioned in programs or anything of the like. And then, during that time, I was also the director-producer at Green Mansions, which was a rather interesting summer hotel, as it were, which had a large performing element, in which we had, of course, an orchestra for the dancing and the like, and but we also had performers, actors, singers, dancers, and the like, and I led that for a few years, and in the summers, interesting work, and then, let's see, where were we next? And out of the opera work that I had done with the North Shore Friends of Opera, came an invitation to direct an opera at Penn State. It was Puccini, and I went there to do that, and it turned out to be very successful. The young singers and actors and I were able to bring off a very exciting performance. And out of that came an invitation for me to come to Penn State as an assistant professor, but to lead the directing and acting program, which I did, and it was one of the happiest jobs I've ever had for, I think, 6 years, something like that. And during that 6 years, I went from assistant professor to full professor, which I'm told is something for record. And It was probably in 4 years that I got the full professorship. It was nothing I had ever applied for, but I think they gave me because they wanted to keep me. And I was happy to be kept there. I had colleagues at that program that became collaborators and creative associates and good friends. Manuel Duque, he and I had something in common. One of the reasons I hired him was that he had studied with Sandy Meisner in Sandy's professional training program. And so he was very conversant with the kinds of things that I was. I think more conversant than I was. And then Archie Smith, who was the brother of a professor of mine at St. John's, and who had been a Broadway actor and was out in, I think, Seattle at that point, acting with his wife, and who was an acting teacher. And I hired him too. And the three of us turned out to be a very good combination in running that program at Penn State. It was a very good acting program, very good directing program, and we became kind of nationally known, and it was very rewarding. One of the reasons I left and went to Boston, which was one of the places I got an offer from, was that my sons were not doing as well in the schools there as we would have wanted them to be doing. And we thought they'd do better elsewhere, and certainly in the Boston area. Rochelle, who was a typical Italian in many ways, though she was a very sophisticated New York bohemian, was only happy in large cities, namely New York, and where she had a practice with artists in New York, and a real following, and she thought she might be able to develop something of the same in Boston. And so we came to Boston to BU, which was a dreadful department, badly run, and in which I made no good contribution to speak of. And it was not a good 3 years. I was happy to leave there, and they were happy to see me go. And I went back to New York, where I started my own acting studio, which turned out to be quite remunerative for several years. My studio I shared, actually it was not mine, it was his, with, I'm blocking names again, it'll come back to me. It was right in the theater district on West 48th Street, I believe, right off Times Square. And that went very well. I had some interesting students, and I also ran a program at, I think it was NBC, for actors, and that went on and off for 10 years, during which time I went elsewhere. I didn't do much acting during that period at all. It was almost all acting and directing. I mean, teaching, not acting, teaching and directing. And let's see, I went out to Amherst for what was supposed to be 1 year during that time, because the head of the department was ailing, and I turned out I spent 2 years there, and they asked me to stay to be the head of the department, and I really didn't want to be the head of the department. I have never felt those were my strong capacities. I'm best on the floor, directing or teaching, and not in the administrative work. While there, one of the productions I did was Hamlet. It was the only time I've ever directed Hamlet. I've directed or been in a lot of other Shakespeare productions. There was a student there, a little older than the other students, named Michael Higgins, and he did the Hamlet. And he had been something of a young stand-up comedian. He was highly intelligent and very gifted, and he did a simply superb Hamlet. I don't think I've seen many better Hamlets than his. He was the right age. He had a sense of humor that he brought to the role, and I left there after 2 years. Rochelle and my sons, Jordan Francesco and Jonathan Antonio, the reason they have those names is to remind them that they have a half Italian genesis. They were born, Geordie was born when we had moved down from West 58th Street, just behind the plaza where we lived, and we moved down to 123 Waverly Place, which was about a half block from Washington Square, and we had a 4-room apartment in an apartment building, and that's where Geordie was born. And Geordie, who is now 61 years old, oh my Lord. And then Jonathan, then we moved, I think just before Jonathan was born, I'm not certain now, to 119 Waverly Place, just a few houses closer to the square, into a brownstone, and which was purported to be the deepest brownstone in New York City. And it had started out to be a regular brownstone, but at just that juncture, when apartments called flats in those days were becoming very popular in New York. So this brownstone apparently had been converted into 5 flats, 5 stories of flats. And we had the ground floor. It had, just before we moved into it, been with it the basement, which would have originally been intended but never used as the kitchen floor of a brownstone, a fraternity house, the first floor. So the place was a mess, and they were happy to rent it to us, this enormous, deep place, for $300 a month. And they restored it before we moved in. You know, they plastered the walls and fixed it up, and it was in many ways a very nice place to live. The boys each had a separate room, which had been the servants' rooms, and we had a big living room, and there was a reception room and a dining room, and downstairs there was a large studio, which I then used partly as a studio for myself, for rehearsals and for teaching, and occasionally I would rent out to other people. And then there were two rooms deep in the back of the basement, and it was not a deep basement, it was kind of half on floor level, on street level, with two rooms which eventually became the bedrooms for Rochelle's daughters, my stepdaughters, and that gave us a lot of room for our large family, and that was very nice. Carol, by this time, the young daughter, was a student at Cooper Union, a very prestigious place to go because it was scholarship. There was no, you didn't pay for it at all, and you had to be promising, and she certainly was very talented. And in the course of all of this, Carol did a lot of work which turned out to seem to be crowding the rest of us out in this large apartment. So Rochelle and Carol found an apartment at 1 Sheridan Square, which is just a couple of blocks away, for which we paid $90 a month, and Carol could move in there and put her stuff all over the place. And incidentally, when Carol eventually moved out and we began to take it over, we didn't want to give it up, not at $90 a month at that point. Much of the work that she'd done as a painter and a photographer and the like had affected the bathroom. And I remember spending a lot of time restoring the bathtub because with paints and acids and the like had been stained. And while there, Rochelle had a sleeping loft put up in the middle of this large room that was essentially all the apartment was. That and a little dressing area and a compact kitchen and a bathroom. So that we had a sleeping loft there, under which we had a dining table anyway, was our dining room. And eventually, when I was at Penn State, I believe, Rochelle gave up the large apartment at 119 and moved in there. And that became useful for her also as a place that she could see her own patients. At one point, what was rather interesting is the boys who had been living with me largely since Rochelle commuted between New York and Penn State. It was a terrible thing for her. The boys decided that they really wanted to live with her for whatever reason, not because I whipped them. So they went back to New York, and Rochelle couldn't accommodate them in that 400 square feet sleeping loft apartment. So she took another small apartment across the street for a while, so that it was largely occupied by the elder of the two boys, by Geordie, but then they decided they wanted to come back to Penn State, which they did, Eventually, Penn State turned out not to be a good place for them at school. Geordie, who was a very intelligent kid, was not doing well at school. Partly it had to do with town and gown. There was some anti-Semitism, various things like that. And we sent him to a private school called the First School, named after the family who ran it, whose name was First, believe it or not. And they had good reports about him, and he managed to squeak through with a high school diploma. And I took this job at BU in what, as I say, turned out to be a very unrewarding 3 years in a very bad department. And we sent Jonathan to the Cambridge School, which was a private school, and Jonathan did very well there. We couldn't have made a better decision. A lot of that was purely accidental, but the gods were on our side, and he did very well there. And he, to this day, he's now 60, maintains friendships with at least one of the faculty members, a music teacher with whom he allied himself. Jonathan became a double bassist, came to BU, where I was still teaching, and was studying music there, and was in the youth orchestra at Tanglewood, and but he had decided he did not really want to continue as a bassist, that if he couldn't be a conductor or a violinist or something of that sort, that he'd prefer to go on and do something else. But he had interesting early beginnings of career in music, and then moved on and decided, after searching the various interesting smaller colleges in the country, he did a tour, literally, and decided to go to St. John's, where I had been a student. I did not figure in that decision. I did not encourage him or discourage him in any of that. It was his own decision, which he made, and he went to St. John's for 4 years, where he did extraordinarily well. And while he was there, this part I did have an influence on. The great dean at St. John's had been Yasha Klein. He had saved the famous 100 Brooks program and regularized it while I was there as a student. And his wife, Dodo Klein, his widow, took Jonathan in as a boarder. And that was an important adjunct to Jonathan's education, because she kept having these brilliant international scholars and writers and like as guests, and Jonathan was there living, and it was a marvelous set of accidents. And Dodo was a wonderful woman who was herself the daughter of a famous German I think a philosopher and mathematician, I can't remember his name now, so that it exposed Jonathan to not only to that wonderful program at St. John's, but also to the background that Dodo brought to him. And meanwhile, Geordie, who started at BU, but was clearly not interested in doing university work, I was able to manage to get him hooked up with an engineering company that was putting up geodesic domes for the American Defense Department all around the Soviet Union. And he joined as a simple member of the team, but eventually ended up as the head of the team within short order. Geordie's a wonderful organizer and can think problems through looking right at them. And for a couple of years, he traveled all over the world, putting up geodesic domes around the Soviet Union, wherever they could get a toehold. And also he did some work in Africa and Asia, and that was wonderful. I was so glad. That was a very good substitute for college for him. It fit just right. And eventually, when Geordie got back to Boston, he joined a large engineering company where he did very well. All of this without a degree of any kind. And it was a family-owned company. And he was apparently highly valued until he hit the glass ceiling. That not being a member of the company, he wasn't going to rise any higher. So at that point, he quit. And at that point, I think Jonathan was out in Santa Fe, and Geordie joins Jonathan there, and I think Jonathan was not sure why Jonathan was there, except St. John's had a new campus out in Santa Fe, and that may have been one of the reasons. And Geordie joined him there, and there was a lot of film work going out in Santa Fe, and they got involved with that, which eventually led them to Hollywood, where they went on working on film. And I leave that there.